The years following World War II sparked a lot of fear and tension, all related to the Soviets and the Cold War. The end of World War II was also followed by what we now know as the golden age of capitalism. It was this period of time, almost 30 years, where we had unprecedented economic expansion, stable prices, low unemployment, and a rising standard of living. This golden age of capitalism continued well into the 70s. 1973 is ultimately what we see as the end of it. And it's also a period of time where we see a lot of new innovations, things like the television, air conditioning, dishwashers, long distance phone calls, jets where you could fly around the world. So it was a really, as much of it was a time of fear, it was also a time of a lot of excitement and change. The United States following World War II was the world's most predominant industrial power. The Cold War fueled industrial production, but our economy started to shift in these years following the war, shifting away from manufacturing, and we see some increases in service type jobs, education, things related to information or communication, finance, and even entertainment. The union's success in raising wages during the war is part of what leads to manufacturing decline, because businesses start to use more and more mechanization. So you don't need as many people working in factories. You also have the trend towards larger and fewer farms that continued, but you also see an increase in production with machinery, fertilizer, irrigation, new crop strains that all led to that increase in production of crops. The main engines of economic growth was residential construction and consumer spending. The years following the war is known as the baby boom. I talked about this a lot in AP Human Geography and even World Geography, that period, it's that bump in the population pyramid where people are just having tons and tons of kids following the war. And along with that baby boom, you see people shifting away from cities and moving out into suburbs. The number of houses in the United States actually doubles in the 1950s, and most of these new houses that are being built are in the suburbs. And you actually have such a demand that houses need to be built extremely quickly. And William and Alfred Levitt, they're a pair of brothers, became the most famous suburban developers. And they built a couple different towns that were quickly built homes. They were kind of uniform looking. If you want to learn more about Levittowns and what suburban life in the 1950s looked like, there's a link on the assignment doc where you can watch that video about Levittown. California became the most prominent symbol of the post-war suburban boom. You do see a population shift of more people moving to California. By 1963, California is the most populous state in the US. Most Western growth, though, is taking place in like metropolitan areas, mainly decentralized clusters of single family homes and businesses that are kind of united in a web of highways and interstates. In the West, and especially places like California, and if we think about like what we know about Los Angeles, where Los Angeles is so spread out and there's just a network of roads and highways all over the place. The life in the West really centers around the car, and that's really true of other places in the United States as well, but it is especially important in the West, and especially in places like California. Consumerism also becomes highly widespread, and consumerism and the ability to gratify market desires, like being able to go out and purchase things for your family, started to become the measure of freedom. It replaced ideas of economic independence and democratic participation as the central definition of American freedom. It all kind of became about a consumer culture. And this also feeds into this idea of American superiority, and American products were marketed around the world. Really, our consumerism and our ability to create products and sell products in a mass market was one of our most powerful Cold War weapons, because the Soviets wouldn't have been enjoying consumer culture in the same way. TV also replaced newspapers as the most common source of information and also started to become the leading leisure activity. This even changed people's eating habits. Instead of sitting down at the family table, people would buy TV dinners and they would have TV trays, and people would sit in their living room with their TV dinners and their TV trays, and they would sit and eat dinner as they watched TV. That wasn't really something that had ever happened before, even with the radio. Nobody sat down with their trays and ate in front of the radio, but the TV really changes that. The TV, though, in the 1950s, what we're talking about is, television that often avoided controversy. The shows that were on in the 1950s showed kind of a bland middle class life. But the thing that was most effective on the television was advertising. Television shows would have commercials. We're familiar with commercials these days, but television shows would be sponsored by various companies and their products. And so that would get people to want to go out and buy those things. The car, of course, was a part of the standard consumer package of the post-war era. By 1960, 80% of Americans had at least one car. 14% had two or more. All of those cars that were being purchased in that period of time would have all been made in the United States. And really the place where they all would have been made would have been Detroit, because Detroit was home to immense auto factories. Auto factories didn't really get long-term defense contracts. They did get, they had defense contracts in the midst of the war, but in the post-war world, these auto factories don't really get defense contracts, and that will be a long-term problem for American car manufacturers. But when we're talking about the 1950s, the car transformed daily life, and with the building of the interstate system, people used the interstate system to use their cars in ways that they never had before. Going on vacation, drive-in theaters, people would go to. Restaurants would be drive-up. McDonald's started as a drive-up hamburger restaurant. This new suburban put pressure on the family, especially women. Women, of course, lost most of their World War II era jobs. There's a sharp post-war drop, but the nature and the aims of women's work were quite different. In the 50s, the modern woman would have worked part-time to help support a middle-class lifestyle, but it certainly wasn't a requirement. Women didn't have to work, or at least the idea was that women shouldn't have to work. It was more for some personal fulfillment or sense of independence. But the suburban family breadwinner was male, and women were somewhat expected to stay at home. And marriage became the most important societal goal for women. And to that end, men and women actually got married quite a bit younger. Women on average were 20 when they got married in the post-war era. Men were 22. Men and women also divorced less frequently and had more children. The population in the United States during the 1950s actually grew by 30 million. And that was partly because of the baby boom, but it's also a result of increased life expectancy. But this idea of the family and the American family specifically was a weapon in the Cold War. Women were able to stay at home. They were not required to work. Soviet women were required to work. They did not have the luxury of being able to stay at home. And so, this idea of the American family and like, look how wonderful the American family is, was a tool. It was a way to kind of look at the Soviets or have other people who weren't communists say, hey, look at the Soviets and look at all the women working. And here over in the United States, women don't even have to work because life is so much better. And advertising really conveys that idea, right? Especially the idea that women enjoyed their role as homemakers. And certainly some women did enjoy their role as homemakers. But as we see moving into the 1960s, many women did not enjoy their role as homemakers. So this massive move to the suburbs certainly promoted Americanization, and it created very real and rigid racial boundaries. As late as the 1990s, nearly 90% of suburban whites lived in areas that had less than 1% of a non-white population. This is kind of a legacy of government decisions, even dating back into the New Deal with the Federal Housing Administration. Real estate developers played a hand in this. Banks also had, and residential developers all had kind of a role in this. Federal agencies that gave loans, like the FHA, barred resale to non-whites. Many non-whites were kind of excluded from being able to purchase in the suburbs. Banks wouldn't give loans to an African American family. Like if an African American family wanted to buy a home in Levittown, a bank just simply would not have approved their loan. They would have only approved a loan in a segregated area. The Housing Act that was passed in 1949 authorized Congress to construct public housing for people, and it had just a really low ceiling for income of the residents. So it limited these housing projects to the very poor. And under programs of urban renewal, sometimes poor neighborhoods were torn down and replaced with new housing and retail that would have been at a much higher price. So it would have only really been designed for whites. We call that gentrification. So whites moved to the suburbs, and so then Puerto Ricans, African Americans tended to move into urban areas. And so that racial exclusion that was happening kind of became self-reinforcing because of limited job opportunities. It's also reinforced by something known as blockbusting, where real estate agents would exaggerate warnings of an influx of non-whites to get whites to sell their homes. Then they would turn around and sell those homes to people who are non-whites. And so you start to see like some of these seeds of protest, especially in urban spaces. This is going to be something that's really important in the civil rights movement, that a lot of the civil rights movement has to do with segregation, but it doesn't deal a whole lot with the de facto segregation, the not law that is happening in these northern urban spaces.